son. Where'd you find this?
Buckle up, buttercups. It's time to get down to business. Oh, yeah. It's the Totally Legitimate Business Podcast. Totally legit.
All right, folks, we are here again. It's the Totally Legitimate Business Podcast and another incredibly exciting guest. Today we're joined by investigative reporter, professor of journalism, and longtime environmentalist advocate for Long Island, New York, Mr. Karl Grossman. Welcome to the show.
A pleasure to be with you, James.
So, we briefly talked on the phone about, my areas of interest that led me to you, and you seem to be the guy. All of your stuff, and I've got your websites here, which we'll talk about here shortly, but EnviroVid, the YouTube page, I've been scouring that. There's so much good content on there.
EnviroVideo. We don't want anybody to go to EnviroVid and to be rejected. It's EnviroVideo.com.
EnviroVideo.com, and you've got a great YouTube page that's super fleshed out, as well as your personal website. Karl Grossman has links to all of these things as well. But before we get into all of the work that you've done, I'm really interested in what led you to journalism, and then what leads you to ultimately uncovering a very large web of nuclear silliness occurring in Long Island.
Well, this is a very corny story. I had originally thought I'd become an academic, a college professor, which I became in any case, but teaching journalism, not history or sociology like I thought. And I went to Antioch College in Ohio, and they have a very elaborate internship program. It's a quarter system, and every quarter they put you on an internship. And I was given an internship at the Cleveland Press. And above corny story, above the entrance of the Cleveland Press was the motto, "Give people the light and they'll find their own way." And it wasn't just the words above the entrance. In fact, there was a clutch of, they didn't call them investigative reporters yet then. This is way back in 1960. But that's what they did. And I was just a copy boy. And sometimes I'd be given the night shift. And you'd be in a fairly empty city room and be taking calls. And when somebody called about something happening in Cleveland, you put a memo together for the city desk to look at. If it was like a suburb of Cleveland, Shaker Heights, you put a memo together for the suburban desk. But if it was some horror story, a tale of injustice and inequity and unfairness, you put together a memo and gave it to this clutch of investigative reporters. And then, this utterly amazed me. After them looking into the issue, documenting it, and then publishing it, and the Cleveland Press, they seem to run exposés twice a week. There was a real... they would have been called muckrakers, these reporters, a few years earlier, because that's what they did, muckraking. What's now called, for the last 50-so-many years, investigative reporting, crusading journalism. After they documented this horror story, half the time there was a resolution. Half the time, the very publication of the facts, giving the people the light, enabled them to find their own way and for society to do the right thing and to solve the issue. So I just thought this was the coolest thing. I jumped back on my motorcycle, headed back with my girlfriend, headed back to who I absolutely, this is years later, woke up with this morning, headed back to, many years later, headed back to New York, where I'm from, because Cleveland's a great, great town, but it's not my territory. I figured, let me go back to New York and get into investigative reporting in New York. I wanted to get to the Herald Tribune, which I always thought was the
top
best
of the
newspaper in New York. Doesn't exist anymore. In fact, when I was going to hopefully shift to the Herald Trib, it was 1967. It went out of business. And I then stayed on Long Island. Unfortunately, the Long Island Press, and I was at the Long Island Press at that point, also went out of business in 1977. And at that point, I was able to shift to what was my original destination, academia, become a professor at the State University of New York at Old Westbury, and began teaching what they were looking for, because the woman, Deidre English, who was the initiator of a investigative reporting class at Old Westbury, SUNY Old Westbury, way back when that term investigative reporting first began, this is early 70s, in fact, was supposed to be the first class in the nation, an investigative reporting class. But she got a job as editor of Mother Jones. So she was off to San Francisco. They needed a replacement. I was actually referred to the folks at the school by Irv Molotsky, who was a New York Times reporter, who knew my work, and we had covered stories together on Long Island, and got the job. And I've been at SUNY Old Westbury teaching investigative reporting ever since. That's 46 years now. Also running an internship program to enable the students to, well, do what I did to gain inspiration to go into journalism. And I've also taught courses there, environmental journalism, regularly, because, well, that's been a very big issue on Long Island. TV documentary, theories and techniques has been because I do that Enviro video television show now for many years, and I was an anchor at WSNL TV on Long Island and so forth, politics of media and so forth. And getting back to the nuclear thing that you mentioned, Long Island was eyed, this is back in the 60s and 70s, as, well, in the parlance of the nuclear promoters at the time, as a nuclear park. There would be 7 to 11 nuclear power plants on Long Island. This all was a result, in fact, of Con Edison, which is the big utility in New York City, wanted to build a nuclear power plant in Ravenswood in Queens, right across the Hudson River from Manhattan, in the geographic center of New York City. And it was stopped. It was blocked by anti-nuclear activists from the city. They got a law introduced in the city council to preclude the siting of any nuclear power plant within the boundaries of New York. And at that point, Con Ed said, forget it. We'll just stick with our Indian Point nuclear power plants, since closed, incidentally, just 2 years ago. And meanwhile, this dopey utility on Long Island, the Long Island Lighting Company, which in fact was to be taken over by Con Ed in 1948. I mean, I wrote a book on LILCO, Long Island Lighting Company, and its nuclear adventures, which ultimately put it out of business, called Power Crazy, because it was going to then join with a place called Brookhaven National Laboratory. It was a national laboratory set up on Long Island in 1947 on an old military base, an old army base, Camp Upton, where Irving Berlin was stationed during World War I. And he wrote, how I hate to get up in the morning. But after World War II, there would be no more bugles playing, waking up the soldiers at Camp Upton. And the site was available for, well, the folks at the Manhattan Project were very desperate after this crash program to build atomic weapons was over. When they could build more, they built tens of thousands of them, and the hydrogen bomb under Edward Teller. But what else could you do with nuclear power? So we could keep our jobs. The big contractors in the Manhattan Project were GE and Westinghouse, who ultimately became the Coke and Pepsi of nuclear power plants, actually worldwide. And in any case, these folks figured, let's get a laboratory which will concentrate on civilian nuclear power, radiation for food, nuclear-powered airplanes and rockets, all kind of civilian uses. Also do research into atomic physics, but mainly it was civilian uses of nuclear technology and nuclear power plants. And there was a close relationship, it turns out, between Brookhaven Lab and the Long Island Lighting Company. The wife of the director at Brookhaven Lab, and a guy named George Vineyard, his wife Phyllis was on the board of the Long Island Lighting Company. I mean, it was like a partnership between the Brookhaven Lab and Lilco. I mean, there was these hearings for these various nuclear plants. One was to be at Shoreham. Actually, it would be 3 in this 7 to 11 package at Shoreham. It's the North Shore of Long Island, along the Long Island Sound. There would be 4 at Jamesport. In any case, the Brookhaven Lab scientists teamed up with the Lilco lawyers in these licensing proceedings. I mean, wait to the end. At the end of the Lilco story, when it was stopped, like Ravenswood 1, Shoreham was built, but it was blocked from going into operation. I mean, the big issue on Long Island is how we're going to evacuate if there's a Chernobyl accident or a Fukushima accident. We're going to all take our cars on the Long Island Expressway,
right,
which is like the world's biggest parking lot anyway, and go through the Queens Midtown Tunnel, or get over on the Tri-Borough. Evacuation would have been impossible on this this island of millions of people. That was a key reason in stopping this scheme. And in the last years of Lilco, William Catacasinos was its chief executive officer, chairman, and what was his former position? Assistant director at Brookhaven National Laboratory. So I ended up, writing a lot on nuclear power and other environmental issues. But nuclear was a big issue to me way back, because now nuclear power is, well, there's nothing happening in terms of, Brookhaven Lab is still there, but the reactors that it's had through the years, 3, and they've made a mess. It's a Superfund site, Brookhaven Lab. There's been books written. Kelly McMasters is a book about growing up in Shirley, New York, just south of Brookhaven Lab, and how it's Kansas City, USA, and she points to Brookhaven Lab and its dumping of nuclear waste. Also, Brookhaven Lab, like all of Long Island, is dependent on a sole source aquifer. So any discharge of radioactive material from the lab gets into the sole source of potable water for people of Long Island. And with Shirley being right next to the southern border of the lab, that's what the folks there were drinking. And so forth and so on. So in any case, Long Island is, and I have had a part in terms of giving people the light about nuclear power and enable them to find their own way in causing nuclear power, causing Long Island to be, these days, nuclear free. None of those 7 to 11 nuclear power plants that were envisioned by the nuclear promoters happened, or the Shoreham is there, just a big hulk of concrete along the Long Island Sound. And those nukes at Brookhaven Lab, it's over with them too. So Long Island is one of the rare nuclear-free zones in the United States.
The more I've been made aware of this stuff by you and kind of where Chris Verga has pointed me, I'm looking at the sheer amount of resources that was committed to turning Long Island into this nuclear paradise. And I'm just interested from your perspective, like, were there moments that were scary as you were doing it? Could you feel the forces against you kind of closing in? Because it's big money. Like, I don't think people fully understand the scale of the type of money that would have been made for a very small number of people, and those people that were really kind of driving that agenda out there. People had been hurt for way less than $1 million. And we're talking about sums that are far greater than $1 million. So is there like any element of, I'm sure this is just kind of inherent with the type of journalism that you do, but was there any moment where you're like, oh, this is getting heavy?
Well, once I wrote the book, Cover Up What You're Not Supposed to Know About Nuclear Power, and I can just go back a touch on that. The book was, well, I had gone to Brookhaven National Laboratory. I had a TV show on WLIW TV, which is on Long Island. It's also now owned by Channel 13 in New York. In any case, I went to Brookhaven Lab to do a show on nuclear. This is early on. I didn't know that much about it. And I put my microphone in front of these scientists and asked them about, what's the issue in terms of danger, and they just dismissed it. They said that these machines are so redundant. There might be a minor accident every 200 years, but perfectly safe. And there I was, again, a while later, years later, covering an open space story on Long Island, and checked my answering machine, and the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant was undergoing a meltdown, was the message. And all I was thinking was how those scientists at Brookhaven Lab had tried to snow me, had really tried to snow me. And it isn't an issue of an accident, minor accident of every 200 years. They really, at Brookhaven Lab, indeed, what I did with the book was to not just use my own words. I figured if I just used my own words, it would be my words against, for example, my lecture agency after I wrote the book, at one point had set me up with John Sununu to do debates. And I remember in the first debate, which was actually at Tufts, where he was an administrator, his pitch was, look, you're a journalist, I'm a scientist, I'm an engineer. So the way I did the book was to take documents, government documents and corporate documents, and this is before desktop publishing, take a scissor, cut them out from the documents, and reprint them as facsimiles in the book. I figured let the document, again, shine light, and the people will find their own way. This will be the light, the actual documents. And for example, here in the book, I don't know if you can see it on the screen, but I'll put it up. This is the possible size of the area of such a disaster. A nuclear power plant accident might be equal to that of the state of Pennsylvania. And that's repeated over and over again in a report called WASH 740 Update, done at Brookhaven National Laboratory in the 60s. Yeah, right. This is 10 years before the 3 Mile Island accident. Or, well, I start the book off just in terms of enabling people through documents to see, like, what's going on here. This is page small x in the introduction. I reprint what's called the nuclear clause. Here, you can see the documents. Let's see if you can see it there. The nuclear clause. Everybody's homeowner's insurance in the United States has what's called the nuclear clause. This policy does not cover loss or damage caused by nuclear reaction or nuclear radiation or radioactive contamination. This is my policy with Allstate. I might be in good hands if I had a car accident, but
not a nuclear incident.
And then just to show that it's this is. Everybody should check their homeowner's insurance. You'll see it. Here's CNA's. Same thing, the nuclear clause. This policy doesn't. This book, which actually is available on my website for free. if anybody wants to get a download of actually the most recent edition of the book, which I wrote after Fukushima, they can just get it for free.
I'll have all these links in the description, but I'm going to pull this window up now so that everyone can see that.
And here in the book, the cover-up book, I reprint pages of the. This is the safety manual at Brookhaven National Laboratory. A word to the staff. Where is it? Is radiation dangerous to you? It can be, but it need not be. I mean, they minimize it, and then there's illustrations, pages, just to show just the average person, the public, like how these people here in the nuclear industry are being just misled. I mean, the book is full of, and again, you can get it online. Just go to the books page at karlgrossman.com. Oh, and incidentally, when I first started writing the book, a very big literary agent, Hilda Lindley is her name, New York literary agent. She had a house out here in Eastern Long Island. Came to me and because I'm starting to write really about in the wake of TMI, and I told her I'm putting a book together, and she said she'd agent for me, and she went from publisher to publisher in New York, and nobody would touch it. And Hilda came back to me saying that I can't believe it. They're saying that there'd be no interest in nuclear technology after several months. So in fact, then I ran at a party where I live of let me just stop this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let me turn it off. I was at a party in the town where I lived, and there were a couple who have an independent publishing company, Marty and Judy Shepard, and they said, I told them, I can't believe Hilda Lindley can't get a book on nuclear power that I've been writing published, and we'll publish it. So they put it out. It's been for decades now a book that they've had at their publishing house. Marty passed away about a year and a half ago, but Judy is now running the press. And meanwhile, after Fukushima, Marty called and said, let's get a new edition and go back to some of these publishing houses. And his little publishing company had gotten options for movies and stuff. And maybe this time, one of them at least will go for it. And they wouldn't. And at that point, what Marty Shepard said was, we'll put it on our website, download for free. And that's the way it's been now for years with all these documents. It's turned out to be a handbook for people in the movement challenging nuclear power, because no one in big publishing would go for it. As to your question, have I faced resistance? I sure have. I mean, it's not been, and I thought there might be as the years went by, pretty serious stuff. But for example, a lecture agency asked me to, they would represent me, and I said fine. And my first lecture was to be at, it was in Moscow, Idaho, Washington State University. And I really wondered, the safety here. And so from the Suffolk County Police Department, I called up the squad that like protects folks, politicians and stuff, and asked, would you guys have a bulletproof vest that I could wear, So they were nice enough to give me this very light bulletproof vest that I wore under my jacket, and I went to Moscow, Idaho, and it was full of nuclear engineers. There was some sort of nuclear facility near there, and it was loaded with very antagonistic types. But nothing happened. So again, I've been reporting on nuclear technology for since '79, since the 3 Mile Island accident, and though at one point I remember giving a lecture at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater, Oklahoma, where it's near where Karen Silkwood worked at Karen McGee, and it was loaded with Karen McGee engineers and so forth, who were hostile as the folks within the nuclear cult, basically, in Idaho, and I just didn't want to take that interstate. I didn't want to stay in Stillwater for the night after the lecture,
Sure.
And I figured if I'm going to go, I stayed with a relative of my wife's in Tulsa, and it was quite a drive. And I got there I was on the highway where she was driving to meet a New York Times reporter, and this is really, from those scientists who try to bamboozle me and bamboozle my audience by deception, to today. Today the big claim is that nuclear is necessary because of climate change. And you even see in newspapers carbon-free, emissions-free nuclear power. But what you're not supposed to know, like my book's subtitle, cover up what you're not supposed to know, is that the nuclear fuel cycle, mining, milling, enrichment, is highly carbon-intensive. And in fact, nuclear plants themselves emit carbon-14, a radioactive form of carbon. So, it's not as bad as coal, but it's not emissions-free. It's not
right. Squeaky clean.
No carbon at all. And particularly the fuel cycle, where they have it's in terms of fossil fuel, all kind of fossil fuel being utilized to get the uranium for these nuclear plants enriched and so forth. But in any case, I'm alive and well. The decades have gone by, but it's really a hot potato. It's really in terms of, and it's not just, you can blame it on big business. And people on the left like to talk about nuclear as being like one of the ultimate outrages of big business. They don't care how many people end up killed as a result of their making money through nuclear technology. Because these plants, it doesn't take a major accident, routinely emit radioactivity. And there's cancer clusters. I'm on the board of the Radiation and Public Health Project. Folks might want to Google and go to their website. And Joe Mangano, who's the executive director, he's led all kind of studies about the cancer clusters around every nuclear power plant. So on the left, people will say, "Oh, it's big business." They don't care about how much of the planet is rendered uninhabitable for millennia. Don't care about how many people are killed. But I ended up being invited, because of my writings on nuclear, to Russia with Dr. Alexei Yablokov, who he died a few years ago, but he was their Rachel Carson, an eminent biologist, and he was the environmental advisor to Gorbachev and then Yeltsin. And he had read my stuff through the years, and he invited me to go to Russia and speak about nuclear. He was particularly concerned about the use of nuclear in space. I mentioned before Brookhaven Lab and doing this research in civilian uses of nuclear technology, and that was on the atomic laundry list of these characters. Looking at its vested interest, if the Manhattan Project went,
Sure.
What else are we going to do? And he invited me to go to Russia, and he set up. I spoke before the Russian Academy of Sciences. The relationship between nuclear and illness. I addressed it was 2,000 people in a city called Saratov at a sports stadium, and there was people from the UN, and this was an all Russia environmental Congress.
Gotcha.
And there were people from the UN, from the UK, from the US, and I was the only Westerner. Alexei was the chair of the conference to speak, and I did. And it's not an easy road in Russia, as you can. Well, the last time I was in Russia with Putin there, I began going there 1990 or 1989, just as the end of communism,
Right before,
and democracy was beginning there, and a free press was. But then the last time I went, which was about 20 years, I've been 7 times. The last time I went, when that Delta airline left Russian airspace to fly me back to New York, on that plane, flying back, I breathed a sigh of relief with Putin.
Really?
Because, if I went there back there again and would speak about, because he's very into nuclear technology. So
Sure.
The left is right. These big companies are very much responsible for pushing a technology which is lethal, and they don't give a damn whether it be GE or Stone and Webster or any of the companies involved in the nuclear establishment, Westinghouse. But it's not just big business; it's big government. Go back to Brookhaven Lab. Brookhaven Lab is just another one of these national nuclear laboratories. Los Alamos, of course, where a lot of the work occurred on nuclear with the Manhattan Project, or Oak Ridge National Laboratory, or Argonne National Laboratory.
Y12.
It's big science, too. It's big business, it's big government, it's big science. And they're pushing because of a vested interest. These national lab scientists, they're looking to really continue their jobs and their grants in nuclear technology. And in terms of the press, a lot of journalists, as I say, you'll see in the media often emissions-free nuclear power, carbon-free nuclear power, and it's not so. It's relatively low emissions, but any amount of radioactivity can kill.
Not good. Yeah, not good.
And the thing is today, and I do a lot of writing about this and television as well, there's no need to take this trip. No miracles are needed. As a recent book is titled Solar and Wind and Other Safe, Clean, Green Forms of Technology Can Provide All the Energy We Need. Just no need for this technology other than to not just enrich, but to empower, to these nuclear scientists here or in Russia. In Russia, they're dashas, and they're kind of well off as folks in Russian society. And there I've had to debate. In any case, I'm alive and well, and a long-winded answer to your question. Still doing this work of, again, giving people the light about how it's terribly unsafe. It's a dead end. And these days, with the claim that it can deal with climate change, what it does is divert funding from the safe, clean, renewable energy technologies that are here today. I mean, I'm speaking to you now from my little house, little saltbox house, 125, 130 years old. On the roof are 38 solar panels. And you go out to the meter, and it's running backwards because it's providing more electricity than I need, and it goes back to the grid, and you get a check at the end of the year and so forth. It works. I wrote one article, the headline was Solar Bonanza, about my own personal experience, that there's, again, no need for it's a poisonous energy technology that has to be, every nuclear plant in the world should be shut down. And even with that, we're going to have to deal with radioactive waste for hundreds of thousands, if not for some of the stuff, millions of years.
Yeah, I'm interested. You said a couple things that spark my mind here. The first is, do you think you see a lot of people writing pro-nuclear stuff now? How much of that do you think is that journalist actually wanting to make that argument, and how much of it do you think is just literally companies paying for newspapers to do a puff piece? And, especially now, because journalism that you did compared to what journalism is now, you could probably speak on that too. The great disparity between the actual dissemination of truth or fact and whatever we have now. Well,
some of it is like also in power crazy. I spend pages and pages dealing, because there's a chapter how we got so far and where was the press, and there's pages and pages of actually government documents. There was an investigation by the House Ways and Means Committee, and used parts of their report showing the interrelationship between nuclear companies in the nuclear energy business and the media business. Interlocking members of the board. I quote Anna Mayo. She, for years, she's passed talking about how she made a career writing for the Village Voice stories that the New York Times wouldn't touch. And then I interview Alden Whitman, who was a longtime editor at the New York Times, talking about how the New York Times considers itself part of the establishment, and the establishment, the establishment so-called, is very much in favor of nuclear technology, and they don't want. And then you're talking about corporate. Mrs. Sulzberger, who was I think the wife of, I forget now, of the publisher, was in the board of Con Ed and so forth. Well, it was pushing nuclear. And part of it is ignorance. I mean, you give me an hour and a half with the lecture agency, what they set me up to do was, originally I thought I wouldn't need this. But after dealing with Sununu, and Sununu saying, you're a journalist, I'm a scientist, I'm an engineer, I know John Sununu. He formerly worked in the White House and so forth. His son is now the governor of, has been the governor of New Hampshire. I demanded of my lecture agency that if I'm going to be debating Sununu, I want to put all these documents that are in Cover Up What You're Not Supposed to Know About Nuclear Power on slides. This is before, computers, PowerPoint
and stuff.
And like, for example, here in the book, if you can see it, is the SL-1 excursion. In 1961, And here's a picture, I had to get it through the Freedom of Information Act, of a miniature nuclear power plant that was built, exploding. And we were told all along that the worst accident that can occur is a meltdown of the fuel. But in fact, even worse than a meltdown is they call it a reactivity accident, a power excursion, a nuclear runaway, where what occurs is that a control rod, see, a meltdown is a loss of coolant. With a nuclear runaway, it's a control rod which controls the rate of fission going out of control. And these things are automatic. And there's 200 of them in your average nuclear power plant. Just one of them going out of control can create a heating up of that section of the core. And then in seconds, there's an explosion, not a nuclear explosion. With breeder reactors, you can have nuclear explosions. They're based on plutonium. But in the standard nuclear reactor with enriched uranium, you have a steam explosion. And so what they did, this is the Atomic Energy Commission, which preceded the... now we have the Nuclear Regulatory Commission pushing nuclear. And here's a photo. Let's see if I can get to it again in this book, of a miniature reactor set up in Idaho. And I explained in the book, some of this is questions and answers, how the U.S. government was trying to run away from the nuclear runaway. And again, here in the book is, here we got it again, is the nuclear runaway. They made a miniature reactor. They took a control rod, threw it out of control. Here it is exploding. On the next page, I write about and this is a government document I'm reprinting, the SL-1 excursion in Idaho in 1961. Nuclear runaway. The three-man crew was on top of the reactor assembling the control rod drive mechanism and housing. However, the control rod goes out of control. 2 members of the crew were killed instantly by the force of the explosion. The third man died within 2 hours, and so forth. And I go on about these 3 guys. They were buried in lead-lined coffins and so forth. So not only could a nuclear runaway occur, but it's happened, and in fact, with Fukushima, what you had was 3 of those 6 nuclear power plants exploded. This is another crazy thing about nuclear power. I got a call. I mean, this is absolutely nuts. I got a call from a scientist from Westinghouse, and he wanted to meet with me in New York, and his concern, and I've never named him, and he's passed by now, I'm sure. This goes way back. He was an older man now. He explained to me, I remember sitting in Gramercy Park in Manhattan, as he discussed how when they were looking for cladding for the nuclear fuel rods, what they decided to use, they tried stainless steel, they tried this, they tried that, but finally what they decided to use is something called zirconium. There are 30,000 to 40,000 rods composed of 20 tons of zirconium in the average reactor. Zirconium has the great disadvantage it's highly volatile, and when hot will explode spontaneously upon contact with air, water, or steam. Zirconium dust and air will explode instantly, for which reason a speck of it is used. This is when I was writing this book. Flash bulbs were still used. They were using zirconium for the element in a flash bulb to provide light.
Gosh.
Zirconium, with the explosive power pound for pound of nitroglycerin, catches fire and has the potential to explode at a temperature of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, well below the 5,000 degree temperature of a meltdown. Before that, zirconium reacts to the heat by drawing oxygen from water and steam and letting off hydrogen. So what happened at Fukushima is that there was the tsunami and the cooling system, the backup wasn't functioning, and there was a heat up. But instead of a ultimately three of them, but instead of a meltdown happening right off, the heat up caused the zirconium to generate hydrogen, and those were hydrogen explosions. So, I mean, again, I can go on and on and on. And if, in my experience, if you can sit down and show reporters or even people in public office, again, give people a light, they'll find their own way. For example, when I was anchoring at WSNL TV, the commercial TV station in Long Island, Mario Cuomo was the governor in New York, and he was running for governor then. And I was interviewing him for a segment for the news, and he was favorable about nuclear power. It was good economically, jobs. And then he knew my writing because he was from Queens in New York, and my stuff, the Long Island Press was based in Queens, so he knew my stuff. And also it circulated in Nassau and Suffolk on Long Island. And after I was through with the interview, I said, he wasn't governor yet. I said, Mr. Cuomo, I just wrote a book called Cover Up What You're Not Supposed to Know About Nuclear Power. And could I show you some of the documents in the book and talk to you? And he said, sure. And we sat down after the TV interview, and I went through the book and sat with him for almost an hour. And that was it for him. He became a leading figure in the fight against this first nuclear power plant that Lilco had built at Shoreham. And he was very much anti-nuclear after that. It just takes a little bit of education. But the reason I call the book Cover Up is that this information has been methodically covered up. I mean, I start the book. This is this introduction right before the page on the nuclear clause. You have not been informed about nuclear power. You have not been told, and that has been done on purpose. Keeping the public in the dark was deemed necessary by the promoters of nuclear power if it was to succeed. Those in government, science, and private industry who have been pushing nuclear power realized that if people were given the facts, if they knew the consequences of nuclear power, they wouldn't stand for it. If people knew that the kind of accidents that happened at 3 Mile Island, and before that it was at the Fermi reactor, at Browns Ferry, at Windscale, at SL1 is where the runaway happened, among others, the sort of huge catastrophes which have been only barely avoided or be expected, they'd be damned upset and would insist a stop be put to nuclear power. So an army of public relations practitioners has been working for decades to, in the jargon of the trade, make people think of Citizen Adam, quote, Citizen Adam as a friend before the truth became manifest. I mean, this story is not a new story. It's an old story. I mean, right across from it, I start the book off with a passage from Deuteronomy. I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore, choose life that you and your descendants may live. I mean, that's the biblical admonition, that you have a choice between darkness and light, between life and death. And these have been people, and these have been government agencies, and these have been corporations out of vested interests that have been have sent people in the wrong direction. And if they're informed, they'll say no to nuclear. That's what happened in Long Island. The New York Times was pushing nuclear on Long Island. The Long Island newspaper Newsday was pushing nuclear to fare thee well. And but finally, here's a quote from Ibsen: "The truth is a lion in the street." That my small voice and the small voice of some others. Dave Wilmot of what's called Suffolk Life, not in business anymore, speaking about the dangers of nuclear power and providing people with the information, with the light, turned the situation on Long Island so we're nuclear free. On the other hand, you have journalists like Westinghouse and GE. I was talking how that 80% of nuclear power plants in the world are of GE manufacture or design. I mean, the French plants, so it's all Westinghouse pressurized water design. GE for years owned NBC.
Yeah, right. I always bring that up, and people just sort of glaze over that. But especially during this period, they owned
they owned one of the Coca,
one
Pepsi.
of the big three.
Westinghouse owned CBS. I mean, at one point, I was up to get a. I would know. I was trying to get, and in fact, I was invited to apply for a job as a producer at 60 Minutes. And I thought I'd get it, and Don Hewitt, who was the executive producer of 60 Minutes, saw a small documentary I had done, which was on local TV, it was on 3 Mile Island, called 3 Mile Island Revisited. That was one of the first documentaries done by Enviro Video that we've talked about. And in the beginning of the documentary, there's a woman who lived in Harrisburg, and she shows or near Harrisburg, and she shows a photo of a two-headed calf born after the accident. And Hewitt on the phone, in fact, he called me at school where I teach at SUNY Westbury, and I'd say, saw your documentary, and I saw that photo of the two-headed calf, the mutation, and it was in the connection. The woman is showing first some dandelion leaves 3 foot long.
Right.
And then she went to the photo. I said, why didn't you go to the farm and take some video of the two-headed calf? I said, well, it was stillborn. And then he goes on saying, and in the documentary, you have this guy, Harvey Wasserman. And Harvey was involved. In fact, he wrote a book, Harvey co-wrote a book with others, Killing Our Own. And he says, and involved with Greenpeace, and he keeps talking about radioactivity, said Mr. Hewitt. And I said, well, Mr. Hewitt, that's the problem. It's radioactivity that's the problem. And like he didn't get it, and I didn't get that producer's job at 60 Minutes. But I found. I remember doing a reporter in Santa Fe, New Mexico, writing a piece about cancer as a result of pollution, nuclear pollution, at Los Alamos National Laboratory nearby. I think it was called the New Mexican was the newspaper. I wrote it years ago. And how that guy was fired. That the director of Los Alamos Lab went to the publisher of this newspaper, complaining and so forth. So again, in selecting a title for the book, the operable, when you get to nuclear, the operable term is cover up, and it continues to this day. In fact, right now, the nuclear juggernaut is pushing like never before, really, since the early days, using climate change as the excuse, but again, No Miracles Needed is a book by Dr. Mark Jacobson, and people should just get it. I also did a TV show with Mark, and you can just look on the Enviro Video website, and in fact, 2 of them with Dr. Jacobson. He's an energy expert at Stanford University. An engineer. I mean, nobody can say he's a journalist. He's an engineer. He runs their I think it's called the Energy, whatever center at Stanford. And he's, as an engineer, has looked at alternatives to nuclear. And no miracles needed. That existing technologies can exactly what Dr. Jacobson says, can provide all the energy we need.
In a much safer way.
It is much safer, in a safe way. This ain't safe.
Yeah.
In fact, I have one document which is really important. After 3 Mile Island, it was a House committee called in, I think it was the chair of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, to give an assessment of the likelihood of a meltdown. And the NRC person, it may have been a few years after, I forget exactly the date, but he said about a 40% chance over a 10-year period. And that could be off by 10%, like a 50-50 chance, essentially. And you look at every decade, 3 Mile Island in the 70s, Chernobyl, 86, Fukushima, I mean, and so it's actually not even much safer. It's solar and wind are safe. This is well, Dr. Goffman's book that he wrote, and he was associate director at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. He was in the nuclear establishment and was courageous and wise enough to break from it. His book that he did with Arthur Tamplin was also at Lawrence Livermore. Is entitled Poisoned Power. Poisoned Power. This is poisoned power. And then it turns out, getting back to, was an hour ago when we started talking, you get back to Long Island, and the idea was, once that Ravenswood wasn't allowed to operate, to be built, to Long Island becoming the nuclear electricity wholesaler for the whole New York and Northeast area. It would there'd be 3 nuclear power plants in Shoreham. There'd be 4 at Jamesport. There'd be a bunch in between for this Long Island nuclear park. Again, well, one of the reasons too that the nuclear industry was attracted to Long Island was, well, the 2 reasons basically was that a standard nuclear plant needs like 1 million gallons a minute of coolant, But the other main reason was the Brookhaven Lab connection. In fact,
right.
Where the first nuclear plant was supposed to go on Long Island was not Shoreham, it was Lloyd Harbor. That's where the chairman of LILCO at the time lived. Charlie, I forgot his last name. He thought these people not only don't know, but, it was okay for Charlie, whatever his last name was, to have a nuclear plant in his neighborhood. And then a Lloyd Harbor study group was formed that challenged, with long hearings were held. This is like 1960, or we go way back. And so what LILCO decided in the early 60s, so what LILCO decided to do was we're going to go to Shoreham. Why Shoreham? That's where a lot of Brookhaven Lab scientists lived. So there wouldn't be...
Right.
But the people who lived at Lloyd Harbor and were back of the Lloyd Harbor study group didn't say, well, it's not in our backyard, it's okay. They just kept going. Irving Like was their attorney.
They just kept chasing it. Wherever they tried to move it, they would keep chasing it.
It's really in everybody's backyard. The likelihood of, well, just to take the Chernobyl accident, Dr. Yablokov and other European scientists did an analysis. It was published by the New York Academy of Sciences, incidentally, about the death as a result of the Chernobyl accident. And we go back decades now, but the book is just add more numbers to the death toll. But they found that people died in Belarus, not just in Ukraine, that's where Chernobyl was, but like all over, wherever the cloud of radioactivity went in.
Right.
And they checked medical data and all, and they found at that point 845,000 people, 1 million people then, at that point, this is a number of years ago, died as a consequence of the Chernobyl accident. It was nobody's backyard. It is nobody's backyard. The fallout from Fukushima spread all over the world, into the Pacific. And
Right.
I mean, you wouldn't want to have sushi in San Francisco after Fukushima. But again, as Dr. Mark Jacobson says, no miracles needed. As long as people understand, including people in power. I must say, well, including people in power, they don't know. I think they can be educated, but some, as you suggest, are sort of, well, because their salary depends on doing something bad, they keep doing something bad. They're involved in a corporation or a government entity that does something bad, and it's well, for me as a journalist, nuclear has always been on the top of my list of horror stories. And how I got into this was all because of horror stories. This is, I've written about lawsuits brought against Brookhaven Lab by people who've lived around the lab miles away, but affected the disease level. But they had a thing called the high flux beam reactor, with a big smokestack, which was right next to the Long Island Expressway. And what was coming out of that smokestack was often, well, an output which contained nuclear poisons that spread around Long Island. The breast cancer rate on Long Island has been connected to, it's at a high breast cancer rate, to the fallout from Brookhaven Lab.
And was that also the reactor that was leaking tritium, or was that?
No, that was it. See, they didn't at Brookhaven Lab take nuclear like their safety manual says it can be, but tritium is essentially radioactive water. What happens in a nuclear power plant is that the H2O becomes H3O, becomes tritium, radioactive water, and there's no way to get that other O out. There's no really filtering of it, and in fact, when they were first considering siting Brookhaven Lab, this is, again, in the wake of the Manhattan Project, we got to have a lab that'll focus on civilian uses of nuclear technology, but can keep our jobs and keep our contracts and so forth. There was concern about putting this lab that was going to focus on nuclear above an area dependent on a sole source aquifer, which all of Long Island is. There was talk about putting it in Jersey, New Jersey, where people get their water from a river. But they finally did it in Yaphank, or Upton, really, and all you could do with that tritium, and this is what began at Brookhaven Lab, when it turned out that tritium was in the wells of people who live near the lab and dependent on this water, is create a system of pumping the water up to the northern portion of the lab and then back and back and back. But tritium has a half-life of, I forgot what it is exactly, but it's a couple of hundred years is its hazardous lifetime. You got to keep pumping for a couple of hundred years.
Yeah, seriously. No interruption.
With the end of the Indian Point nuclear plants, what was planned was to dump some of the tritiated water, which had been in tanks and stuff, into the Hudson River. Or in Fukushima, there's tritiated water in hundreds of tanks just sitting there, and it's begun to be dumped into the Pacific Ocean. It's once created, you can't uncreate tritium. It's a result of fission, and don't believe the hogwash about fusion is safer. I mean, the atomic bomb basis is fission. The hydrogen bomb, the basis is fusion. Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, well, at the end of the Manhattan Project, Edward Teller, got into a big debate about building the hydrogen bomb, the super. And ultimately, he was given his own national laboratory. He had, worked at Los Alamos, but to develop the hydrogen bomb, which he did, the super. In fact, in this book, in Cover Up, I wanted to get a little bit in the connection between nuclear power and nuclear war. And Teller was a big. He claimed that we could survive nuclear war. It was a feasible way to have a war. And it's a suicidal way to have a war. So I wanted to quote from some of his writings on how we can just get out of our fallout shelters, come out and just rebuild society. And I had such a problem with Teller and his people about using. They claimed that it was under his copyright and all the words in his book. I ultimately used cover up what you're not supposed to know about nuclear power. 250 words. That's what's legally allowed, fair use. The relationship between nuclear power and nuclear war, one of the things that was started after World War was on Eisenhower in the 50s was atoms for peace. This is the good side of nuclear power. And, what a sales pitch on that. For example, under the Atoms for Peace program, we trained their engineers and physicists. The Canadians provided them with a reactor, and they got the reactor. A year later, who got an atomic bomb? India, because of the plutonium that's produced in a nuclear. It isn't just tritium, it's plutonium, lots of it. And you don't need much plutonium. 15, 20 pounds is what the Hiroshima bomb had of plutonium. Any nuclear power plant produces just huge amounts of plutonium annually.
Yeah.
And so the Indians got the bomb because of the Atoms for Peace program and the goodwill, I suppose, of the Canadians. Then sooner the Pakistanis got a bomb. And as there's what's called nuclear proliferation, more and more countries have nuclear power plants. There'll be proliferation. More and more countries will have. We're screaming about Iran. We should be getting the bomb and what they might do with it. In my view, after having been in this issue for so long, and I've written about not just nuclear power, but nuclear war and nuclear weaponry. I have a book, Weapons in Space. I have a book called The Wrong Stuff about the use of nuclear. I had broken the story in 1986 about the next mission of the Challenger. This was in The Nation magazine, was to loft a plutonium-fueled space probe with pounds of plutonium into orbit, and it would then head off and into a space probe. And if the accident had occurred, I'd read documents are very important in looking into nuclear and so many other issues in investigative reporting. And I'd read a document in 1985 that NASA and the Department of Energy working together, and they'd have two of these space shuttles loft plutonium-fueled space probes in 1986. And I filed Freedom of Information Action requests with NASA, the DOE, the various national labs involved, Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, asking what were the consequences if there'd be an accident. And I hit a stone wall. They wouldn't give me any. It took months and months. And finally, at the end of 85, I got these documents with a lot redacted about the number of people that would, if the plutonium, if it was an accident. I asked on launch in the lower atmosphere, upper atmosphere. A lot were redacted, but the bottom line was that the likelihood of a severe shuttle accident was 1 in 100,000. And okay, I 1 in 100. And then then in January of that year, in fact, I was on my way to teach my investigative reporting course, and I hear on the radio that the Challenger blew up, and I jumped into an appliance store, saw that image of the Challenger blowing up, and all I was thinking, if it would have been the May mission, when you would have had all this plutonium on board. And so the Nation folks had me write an editorial called the Lethal Shuttle and so forth. And then I ended up getting deeply involved in that issue. I wrote a book called The Wrong Stuff about the use of nuclear in space, and then got into accidents that happen. We've done about 30 nuclear space shots. We've done 30 nuclear space shots, 3 accidents. In the Soviet Union and Russia, they've done over 60, and they've had 6 accidents. It's a 10% accident rate. And in fact,
it's the same rate.
What NASA did with the DOE after the Challenger accident, in fact, there's a chapter in my book titled From 1 in 100,000 to 1 in 76, to change the odds of a severe shuttle accident from 1 in 100,000 to 1 in 76, which is proper odds, because there was like 150 shuttle launches, and there were 2 catastrophes, 2 disasters.
Right.
Oh, and just to add to that, how they figured 1 in 100,000, I write about that in the book too. They got a bunch of NASA people to the Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama and asked them, what's the likelihood you think of a severe shuttle accident? And one will say, very unlikely. And they translated that into numbers. And another one will say, well, extremely unlikely. And they made numbers of that. And that's how they got to 1 in 100. And in science, empirical evidence is what has to drive your reality, not people making up, using words and making up numbers and so forth. So, and in any case, nuclear power and nuclear weaponry, 2 sides of the same coin.
Well, and again, it's like the same egregious offenders. GE, Westinghouse, they also make machines of war. Like, I think most people don't realize that even now today, that is, easily accessible information. And so many of these companies are on Long Island. It begs the question, like, how much of the research and development for all those types of nuclear-powered satellites, nuclear-powered lasers, nuclear-powered railguns, where did that occur? There's a really strong likelihood that many of those components for those things were made on Long Island. The research, even Brookhaven National Lab, like, you go read the charter of Brookhaven National Lab, they created that place post-bomb to retain America's superiority in nuclear research. And it's right, an hour away, 2 hours away from where I'm sitting right now, and I feel like it's just still information that's kind of glazed over. They had, the particle accelerator, which at one point was one of the biggest in the world, even their first reactor. They had the first reactor in the United States post-World War II. Like, a lot of this stuff is occurring right here on Long Island. And I watched Nukes in Space and the sister documentaries on Enviro Video. Again, those links will be in the description. Highly recommend them. What are some other nutty things from, like, the Strategic Defense Initiative era that you came across in terms of, like, how they were going to try and apply nuclear energy in just insane ways?
After my piece on the Challenger's next mission, why are they doing it? The radioisotope thermoelectric generator, which was to contain the plutonium that would be on the Challenger, guess the company who made it? GE. So, okay, that's one of the reasons with GE lobbying. But then I kept wondering, why are they doing this? Because it could affect so many people, and there's been accidents. NASA is described often as a pioneer in solar energy. It's described that way because I'm trying to get the year, was the SNAP 9A accident. Way back, the satellites were powered by plutonium. including there was a Snap 9A system aboard a satellite that was launched. I'm trying to remember the year, whether it was 64, some year like that. And the Snap 9X, and it didn't gain orbit. And it had like 3 or 4 pounds of plutonium. But plutonium is described as the most toxic substance in the universe. I don't know about from the universe, but certainly on Earth, it's the most radioactive substance. Yeah. 1/millionth of a gram could cause cancer. In fact, after the war, because the Hiroshima bomb is uranium, the Nagasaki bomb was based on plutonium. After the war, they did a series called the Beagle tests. For dog lovers, forget about this or not be concerned, but they caused the poor beagle dogs to inhale minute amounts of plutonium and boop, lung cancer all the time. So they did tests after the war to find out its toxicity. So a pound of plutonium is wow. And it didn't have like 3 plus pounds on this stuff, but on the Snap 9A, it didn't achieve orbit, it disintegrated, spreading the plutonium all over the planet. And in this book that I wrote called The Wrong Stuff, I cite, again, I go to government reports, European government reports. They did analysis of where the fallout came. It was like all over the world. And Dr. Goffman linked that to a spike in lung cancer at that point. And why is NASA using on this Challenger mission nuclear? I was GE, but then I got into in All the President's Men, Deep Throat tells Woodward, follow the money. So I felt I better follow the money here too. NASA was set up as a civilian agency in 1958, but soon it found out where the money was in Washington, and it's the Pentagon. So it began partnering with the Pentagon. A lot of those space shuttle missions were 7 colonels, and you didn't hear from them after the flight was over. It was military missions. And actually, the space shuttle was largely designed for military purposes to service military satellites.
Sure.
Then I got into Star Wars, and during the Reagan era, this was not talked about. Actually, what Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative, was based on were orbiting battle platforms and armed the battle platforms, and all the details on this are in the book, which is still available. The Wrong Stuff, and also in the book Weapons in Space. These orbiting battle platforms would have on them hypervelocity guns, particle beams, and hypervelocity and laser weapons. And all these are high energy weapons and need power. So they'd have on them reactors and also superplutonium systems. So, like right now, NASA has a space probe which has gone all the way to Jupiter. It's called Juno. Google it, Juno, and it's powered with solar panels all the way to Jupiter. I was told by the NASA people after I started writing a lot about all this that you can't use nuclear power beyond the orbit of Mars. Well, Juno went way beyond the orbit of Mars to Jupiter. There were alternatives in space as well as on Earth for energy other than nuclear power. And meanwhile, NASA became a pioneer with solar power, and all the satellites now are solar powered. International Space Station, solar power, because NASA realized that you can't use nuclear. What goes up, Newton's law of gravity is still operable, can easily come down, and if it's radioactive material, no matter what Brookhaven Lab says, it can be dangerous. So I mean, there's something, if people want to look up crazy mad science, look up the word hormesis, Hormesis, hormesis. And what that is a theory put together by these nuclear scientists that a little bit of radioactivity is helpful. It strengthens the immune system, hormesis. So don't be concerned about small amounts of relatively small amounts. It'll help, it's healthy. It's not healthy. But it's just amazing. I remember sitting at Brookhaven Lab, and the executive director, the director of Oak Ridge was there, James, I'm trying to remember his last name, I forget it. And he's looking at this audience of like 300 scientists at Brookhaven Lab talking about he felt that there was a mistake going to uranium to fuel nuclear power plants. We should have gone to plutonium right away and create a plutonium economy. And he acknowledges that dangerous to use plutonium, in power plants. But he says, the nuclear priesthood, will be able to manage the nuclear priesthood. I mean, that's a good name for a cult, I'd say.
Yeah, it's very, you're zealot.
Now, there's been a few scientists like John Goffman who have broken from the cult, including a few from Brookhaven Lab, not many. But you could see smiles in the audience, of these. It's a cult issue, really. It's
sure.
Beyond a profit issue and beyond an issue of vested interest.
Yeah, I really just, it's one of those things where, like, the more I'm looking into it, the more the true scope and scale, like, I still can't comprehend it. And again, it's like most general citizens will just think about nuclear energy. If they think about it, it doesn't really factor into their mind. They're not thinking about the ecosystem that exists to perpetuate nuclear energy and the companies and the billions of dollars, trillions of dollars over time. But it's kind of been like this since the 60s. I remember watching, I can't remember if we talked about this on the pre-call, but I remember watching, it's a video from the 60s where they're building a bunker in Greenland called Camp Century, and they're using a nuclear reactor. And it was a video that the Army Corps of Engineers made to be like, look, see how simple this is? We can build nuclear-powered bunkers anywhere, even on Greenland. And to think that even in the 60s and 70s, but I mean, again, especially in the 60s and 70s, there was just like so much of this stuff going on. Most people are just completely unaware of it until there's like long-term health effects down the road. It still amazes me the more I'm looking into Long Island, and even, there's big players from before the bomb on Long Island. The Paul Corporation, Dr. Paul, he invented like the steel mesh system that purified uranium for the bombs. So Long Island, even before Brookhaven National Labs, Long Island, I guess, is just an area where there's a lot of good universities, there's a lot of military stuff, and there's a lot of course, at that point, a serious interest in developing the weapon. But I know this is like another large portion of a whole other thing you kind of uncover. I want to hear a little bit about Plum Island. At what point do you become aware of what's going on at Plum Island?
Before I talk about Plum Island, I just want one last thing about Long Island, if I could.
Sure.
And this is
sure.
In a book that I co-authored with Christopher Verger, who's a historian. It's called Cold War Long Island, talking about nuclear madness. During the Cold War period, what they set up on Long Island were these facilities. They were all over Long Island. There's these facilities where they had Nike Hercules, and then there was a Beaumark missile station as well. These were missiles that were nuclear tipped. And in Lido Beach, in Nassau County, near where you are now in Fort Tilden and in the city, Lloyd Harbor, where the first nuclear plant was to go, Brookville, which is the Gold Coast, Rocky Point, Amityville, some peaceful. They were going to set up these bases for nuclear-tipped missiles at West Hampton. In fact, I did a TV show. You can watch it on YouTube. It's called Avoiding Nuclear Destruction by the Skin of Our Teeth. And what they feared in avoiding nuclear destruction, and it was only by the skin of our teeth, what they feared was Soviet bombers heading to hit New York City. And they figured how we'd stop them right over Long Island would be to have these nuclear-tipped missiles. And they didn't have, at that point, ground-to-air missile technology. So all they would use is radar. And so what they figured that they would do would be to send the nuclear-tipped missile into the formation of Soviet bombers and detonate it. And it would just blow them all up. They didn't have, it wasn't like 1,000 miles away. We're talking about 70, 80, 100, 120, 200 miles away. That was the limiter. Right. The thing was that the Hiroshima bomb, plutonium, same thing. The Nagasaki bomb with the plutonium had like the power of 13, 15 kilotons of TNT. Guess how much in the way of kiloton explosive power these nuclear-tipped missiles would have. The Beaumark missiles, and Beaumark, incidentally, is for Boeing, and the mark for Michigan, which is not doing too well these days, which is 737s.
Yeah, definitely.
The mark would be for Michigan Aeronautical Research Center. So it was Beaumark. And they had this Beaumark missile base in West Hampton. 38 Beaumark missiles, each with enough... again, we're talking about a nuclear tip capable in... among those over 50 Beaumark missiles in West Hampton, of 10 kilotons. The Nike Hercules, not the Nike Ajax, that was the first generation of Nike missiles. The Nike Hercules would have 3, and then 20, and then 30 kilotons. I mean, twice as much as and that would be exploding essentially, well, it depends where the wind was blowing. But near enough over people's heads on Long Island, it would stop. Wow. So in any case, nuclear madness has been jumping to another kind of madness, which is important too. I mean, Long Island, New York, ended up to be a place of a lot of weird things, and one was, we write about it extensively in Cold War Long Island, is Plum Island. And Plum Island is a little island off the North Fork of Long Island, about 1.25 miles off Orient Point. And it was basically the brainchild of Dr. Eric Traub. Remember the name, Dr. Eric Traub. He had been very involved in Long Island in the 1930s. He went here, attended Rockefeller Institute. He was a veterinarian. And he was not only a student at the Rockefeller Institute, he was involved in Nazi activities on Long Island. Let me jump to the book and I'll tell you about some of the activities. I mean, let's see. came to the United States. Traub had been to the United States World War II and was engaged in Nazi activities. In the 30s, he was involved with the Amerika Deutsche Volksland, which established Camp Siegfried in Yaphank, near Brookhaven Lab.
Literally right next to Brookhaven National.
Over 40,000 people throughout New York region arrived by train, bus, and car to participate in Nuremberg-like rallies. This is Michael Carroll, wrote a book about Lab 257, the story of the government's secret Plum Island germ laboratory. And during the war then, during World War II, he went back to the fatherland. And what he was in charge of doing then during the fatherland, being in charge, he was lab chief of Incel Reims, a secret biological weapons laboratory operated by Germany's Nazi government, and worked directly under, reading from Mike Carroll's 2004 book, working directly under Heinrich Himmler. And the idea was to use biological warfare, including against the animals, the livestock of the Soviet Union, which was an ally of the United States during World War II. For anybody young, maybe who doesn't know. But in any case, he comes back to the United States after the war under Project Paperclip. This is a program in which Werner von Braun, who was like the V-2 rocket, was a Werner von Braun enterprise, and a lot of his scientists on the V-2 program. And anyways,
well, and like Dornberger, a lot of aerospace guys, a lot of whom end up working for the companies.
Yeah,
the egregious offenders.
Yeah, they should have been tried for crimes against humanity. But we bring them back here under Project Paperclip, and Traub had all these buddies who he had known from his days at the Institute, and a lot of them were at Fort Detrick, which is the place that the U.S. has used through the years for biological and chemical warfare work. And he suggested that let's do in the United States what we had in Germany during the war. Well, let's get an island, and the island will be a place where we could develop biological warfare to be used against the Soviet Union. And that was what was done. So on this little island off Long Island, a laboratory first, it was Lab 100, as Lab 257, as Mike's book is titled. Then it was replaced by Lab 100, and the focus would be on killing the livestock of the Soviet Union. Newsday, Newsday did John McDonald, an investigative reporter at Newsday, did this very important article on Plum Island and its origins. This is back in '93. The piece began a 1950s military plan to cripple the Soviet economy by killing horses, cattle, and swine, called for making biological warfare weapons out of exotic animal diseases at the Plum Island laboratory, now declassified Army records reveal. A facsimile of one of these records, it was dated 1951, covered the front page of Newsday. Let me read that. I actually wrote it down here. If I can find it quickly, I'll read it for you. Oh, here it is. It was all over the front page of Newsday. Plum Island will permit the Chemical Corps to execute required projects in connection with imported agents and others that might become of biological warfare, BW, significance. So Newsday broke the story. What a place. I also investigated decades ago it began, Plum Island and biological warfare. And finally, what the Department of Agriculture figured. Oh, what finally happened was the War Department, the Pentagon, and this was with Mike Carroll's. He was an attorney, good at investigative reporting. Let me tell you, he had got documents in the National Archives, and he's got documents explaining how it went from the War Department, from the Pentagon to the Department of Agriculture. What the Pentagon decided is, even though it started this work, that if we end up killing their livestock, we're going to have to end up feeding millions of starving Russians, Soviet people, and let's just nuke them. So that became the focus. Well, just nuke the Soviet Union. And so the mission of the Plum Island Animal Disease Center became purportedly civilian. But I was investigating a continual military biological warfare connection. And I don't think I was so wrong. In fact, speaking of Newsday, in 1977, two other Newsday reporters, not John, let's see if I can find this quick. I think it'll be probably in this book. I can find it better. Did work 1977 about an outbreak of swine fever in Cuba. 1971 it occurred. They had to kill thousands and thousands of swine, the Cubans. And what they did was trace Cummings and Featherston that to a CIA facility in the Canal Zone, which the U.S. had then owned. That was jurisdiction of the U.S., and then to a U.S. naval base in Guantanamo, and then it was taken by boat to. This was this African swine fever, which doesn't exist. They note in their investigative reporting, probably still doesn't exist in the Western Hemisphere. It only exists on Plum Island, of all places. And again, this is 1977, so you got to wonder whether it went all civilian when there was a changeover to the Department of Agriculture. In any case, in 1971, I'm busy looking into biological warfare and Plum Island, and the Department of Agriculture runs a dog and pony show. They invited reporters from the major national papers, the Washington Post and so forth, 25 or 30 reporters to come to Plum Island to see the wonderful things they do on Plum Island. We were to meet in Greenport. They were nice enough to invite me. And before we went to Plum Island, we were to go to a meet in Greenport, which is near Orient, which is they have a fleet of little ferries that take the workers to Plum Island. And so we met in Greenport. But before we went, the night before, I called the Department of Agriculture just to make sure I was still invited and we're going to meet tomorrow morning. And the PR guy there says, incidentally, Grossman, we know what you're doing. We only do defensive biological warfare research. And I said, defensive? Yeah, defensive. I mean, where's the line between defensive and offensive?
Yeah, right.
So I write a story, which is on the front page the next day of the Long Island Press, about a government official, this guy from the Department of Agriculture, acknowledged that they only do defensive. But this is the first time they said they do any kind of biological warfare in recent years. Only defensive. And remember going over there on the ferry, really creepy place. The halls are lined with these freezers like you'd have at home freezers with all these disease agents. Under the Department of Agriculture, they claim we're only investigating foreign animal diseases that haven't come to the U.S. That's our mission now. Until the guy said defensive biological warfare research. then they had to, we do that too. But
Yeah, right. They had to amend.
and then with these 30 reporters, I remember in one of the labs there. Well, before in the labs, it was originally, Plum Island was a site of Fort Terry. And we were having lunch at the mess hall in Fort Terry. And because my piece ran in the Long Island Press, it was picked up by the Associated Press, and it was run all over the country, all over the world. And I remember that the PR team from agriculture, as I was eating with the other reporters in this mess hall at Camp Terry, pointing at me as really causing a little problem for the dog and pony show. But then we go into this laboratory, and there's a scientist with this white coat on, this white laboratory coat, and he lifts up, he's talking about how we do this great research, and he lifts up a vial. I mean, this is the story. This is how it begins the next day that I wrote at the Long Island Press. He lifts up a vial and he says that there's enough foot and mouth disease virus in this vial to affect 10 trillion cattle. And then he goes on, that's all the cattle that lives on the earth. In fact, he goes on, that's all the cattle that ever has lived on the earth. And I say, sir, what do you need so much amount of foot and mouth disease virus? And like defensively, he says, well, we're not using it for biological warfare, really.
Yeah, just exactly.
I mean,
super nice.
At this place. Then meanwhile, after 9/11, the Homeland Security took over Plum Island. They were very concerned at that point. The government used it. I mean, Plum Island and this laboratory, Lab 100, is right there, just sitting there on the coast. And this is a major, if anyone wants to take a ferry from eastern Long Island to New London, Connecticut, you pass right by Plum Island and this big lab where they're doing all whatever the work they're doing there. And it's the major marine route. You go through Plum Gut, and you go past Plum Island, and you go up to Connecticut. I mean, you can take a Boston whaler, and I'm not giving any secrets out, but I mean, the concern of the Governmental Accounting Office in a major report done in, this is 2002, was that security, when it was doing explicitly biological warfare directed at Soviet livestock, when the Army was running it, there were jeeps with armed guards, but with the Department of Agriculture, it became, there was cameras there to see if anybody was going to break in, but that's just and some security, but not like what they had under the Army.
Right.
So it was very concerned about terror. Well, it was a report issued. You can get it online. The title is Combating Terrorism, Action Needed to Improve Security at Plum Island Animal Disease Center, and talks about fundamental concerns that leave the facility vulnerable to security breaches. And this is some acknowledgement. A lot of the agents being experimented with on Plum Island that kill animals, kill people too. They passed over to people. And Plum Island is like 120 miles, 125 miles from New York, from Manhattan. It's like 60, 80 miles from Boston. I mean, it's in the population center of the United States. It's a crazy place to do this kind of research, but I mean, this is where Dr. Eric Traub, the father of Plum Island, wanted to have a lab like the lab he had in Germany, during World War II. In any case, after 9/11, it turns over to the Homeland Security people. Now, what happened because of really the government concern? I mean, here they being a little sensible because of the crossover to people and the ease of a terrorist getting into and so forth. Sure. They started to build a replacement lab in Kansas. In fact, they've spent like over $1.5 billion now on this lab, which is my understanding. It's going to be opened, momentarily. It's the National Bio and Agro Defense Facility Lab. It's in Kansas. I mean, is this a smart place to put a lab? I mean, even if it's foot and mouth disease affecting cattle, this is the cattle capital, Kansas, that portion of the Midwest of the United States. I mean, and in any case, that's been built to replace Plum Island. Mike Carroll, he says the island is an environmental disaster. There is contamination all over it. It needs to be forsaken because until actually relatively recent years, nothing was ever taken off Plum Island. They buried it or incinerated it with the burial pits. I mean, there's like over 30 with the ashes or what's left and so forth. And now there's a big push to somehow make Plum Island, this is in Congress today, a national monument, to have a lot of environmentalists, in my view, are kind of mistakenly thinking that you can traipse around Plum Island and everything, would be fine. I mean, this is. I mean, it's like creating. I don't know. It's like creating Love Canal National Park. I mean, this is not too, but it's moving ahead. It's being sponsored by Nick Lolota, who's the congressman, just got reelected from Suffolk County, with a lot of, and just let me explain kind of the proximity of Plum Island to what Fort Terry was about. This goes back to the Spanish-American War, and in the eastern portion of Plum Island, there's like corregidor-like trenches where there were guns, and then there were guns across this Long Island Sound on Fisher's Island, and also guns on the south of Long Island in Montauk. And what they were fearing, like we were talking about a flotilla of Soviet bombers heading to New York, what they were concerned about was a flotilla of Spanish-American warships heading to New York through the Long Island Sound, and we'd catch them with the guns on Plum Island, the guns on Fisher's Island, and so forth. There's no more guns on Fisher's Island or Plum Island, but you can see I've been to them. In fact, I was to them with Congressman Mike Forbes. He's a predecessor of Nick Lolota, who, I've been on Plum Island 3 times. First time it was after, the Department of Agriculture ran its Dog and Pony Show. And then this Lab 100 is supposed to be leak-proof. It's supposed to be have negative pressure and so forth. Well, nevertheless, there was this accident. 1978, got out into a pen with cattle. Had to kill the cattle, and this is this leak-proof lab. And finally, I was to Plum Island a 3rd time. Trying to remember the year. With Mike Forbes calls me up with calls John McDonnell up, and he says that we're going to go on a raid on Plum Island. And he was a conservative Republican congressperson. And I meet him we meet him at the ferry dock in Orient Point. And he approaches the ferry and tells the captain, I'm Congressman Forbes, I'm going to Plum Island. And the captain really didn't want him to go, but, he insisted that he was the congressman. I represent the district with us. And he went, and the idea was, this is a whole other issue. Lyme disease was breaking out earlier on Long Island, and there was concerns that Lyme disease was somehow connected to Plum Island. In fact, in a 1982 book, this is called The Belarus Secret, The Nazi Connection in America. It was written by John Loftus, Loftus. He's still around. And he had been an attorney specializing in pursuing Nazis for the Office of Special Investigations of the U.S. Department of Justice. And his book, The Nazi Connection in America, The Belarus Secret, it tells of, quote, Nazi germ warfare scientists brought to the U.S. after World War II who experimented, this is on Plum Island, with poison ticks dropped from planes to spread rare diseases. I have received some information suggesting that the U.S. tested some of these poison ticks on the Plum Island artillery range during the early 1950s. Most of the germ warfare records have been shredded, but there is a top-secret U.S. government document confirming that clandestine attacks on crops and animals. And Loftus points to the hypothesis that the poison ticks are the source of the Lyme disease spirochete, and adds, sooner or later the whole truth will come out, but probably not in my lifetime. And so it was backed in, it was 1995 that Mike Forbes calls saying that he's inviting John and I for a raid on Plum Island. And, this is after John wrote his pieces about the link to biological warfare. Now we're looking for a link to Lyme disease, and he marches up with two of us following him to the office of the director at that time, Dr. Harley Moon, and says he wants to see any records existing connecting Plum Island to Lyme disease. Lyme, Connecticut, which Lyme disease is named after, is 10 miles from Plum Island. And Dr. Moon insists that we don't have, my story, we don't have any paperwork on that. Then in 2004 came Lab 257 by Carol, who breaks the story about trout. And he also focuses on the connection between Plum Island and Lyme disease. A congressman from New Jersey, and this is speaking of things that have gotten nowhere. A congressman from New Jersey, let's see if I can find the paperwork on this, introduced a bill not long ago calling for a congressional investigation on any connection between Lyme disease and Plum Island. And for Mike, when he got back to Washington, tried all different ways to get any documentation. No records. And this congressman has called for congressional investigation, but it's been, and I've written articles about this, and I can't find the article to read you, but it's gotten nowhere in Congress. A lot of pressure, a lot of what are some people worried about in terms of Lyme disease? And I guess that's Plum Island, a big push to keep it, to make it into a national monument. Big question whether the laboratory is going to be allowed to continue doing whatever it does with this Kansas facility in operation. There was some complaining years ago when people were pushing to end this operation on Plum Island. Because local people very concerned about the Lyme disease connection. That there's 200 jobs at Plum Island, and we want to preserve our jobs. As Mike Carroll stressed, that for 200 jobs, you're going to keep doing things on Plum Island that could impact on. Again, it's like nuclear. It's not just the people in the Ukraine who are going to suffer. from the Chernobyl accident. It's people, quote, quite possibly in a wide area around the Plum Island facility who could, if we're going to keep the laboratory going, doing research. And then, again, we have a lot of well-meaning environmentalists wanting to open it for nature walks.
It's horrifying. The funny thing I've been noticing about a lot of these, especially like chemical sites or the sites that get turned into Superfund remediation sites, is that it just seems like a hilarious trope that we're gonna come in and clean this place up and we're gonna turn it into a park for you. Don't you want that? But what they don't mention is that soil is still leaking whatever chemicals or agents were encased in concrete and buried in a shallow grave somewhere. And I guess the other thing that still, again, it just makes me wonder, kind of like what you're saying, like who knows what they're doing there right now, and who knows what hilarious legalese they've crafted to make definitely nefarious stuff seem like innocuous, rebranding it as this, defensive, the name of the new facility is the National Bio and Agro Defense Lab, right? Yeah, but what they're not telling you about the subtext of that means they're definitely gaming. What if this gets weaponized? What if we weaponize it? Like that's what these places do. And even with I was as you kind of put me onto a lot of the nuclear stuff going on with relation to satellites and stuff, I saw this too. DARPA, they're planning on having a reusable nuclear engine to launch stuff into space. Like DARPA says by 2027 they'll have this.
I've been on that issue. In fact, it received, remember years ago, the Project Censored Award by writing about the use of nuclear in space. And I got to go, 1 year I got the award. I think it went, at that point, it was more times, it's at Sonoma State University. They rate the most censored or the most underreported stories every year. And at that point, it had gotten more Project Censored Awards, than anything, any issue. And this 1 year, then I get a $1,000 check from Project Censored at Fordham University in New York, and it was the Project Censored event. That normally in California was here, was in New York. It was attended by a couple of hundred journalists, and they had me do after I was presented with the award and the check. To say something, and I looked at the audience and I said, I'm very happy to get the check, but I'd to paraphrase Henny Youngman, the comedian, his joke was take my wife, please. I didn't say that. Most of them probably knew that, but quote Henny Youngman, take my story, please. I love the check. I love to get the citation for Project Censored, but take my story, please. But I've been on that story of nukes in space for so many years. And other journalists really haven't. They've written these stories about, well, these days, nuclear-powered rockets to Mars, moon colonies using nuclear. What if the nuclear reactors that go up to the moon blows up on launch, or like the Snap 9A blows up doesn't achieve orbit, comes flying back down, and NASA, the Department of Energy, absolutely pushing for the use of nuclear power in space, and so is Putin's Russia. So is Putin's Russia.
Sure.
It just, it's. Like the good book says, give you a choice between darkness and light, and use your head and do the right thing. But DARPA is a government. Well, speaking of government, if I could, when capitalism, I'm involved writing a new book at this point. And part of it has to do with some of the stuff I've been talking about. And my experience is sort of my experiences over the years in doing investigative reporting on the various issues, particularly these issues that I've been involved in. And one of the points I make is during the Soviet time, all this writing, and I have some of the books written to the Soviet time, that the fault is capitalism. The fault is capitalism. And to a large degree it is. I agree it is. But again, I've been to Russia over and over again. What a mess that has been made in Russia. And you can't blame capitalism until, recent times. Or for 20 years, I was honored to be on a UN committee on disarmament, education, conflict resolution, and peace, and to travel around the world, actually, and meet at the UN regularly and all, and to participate quite fully in the Commission's work. And so, on behalf of the Commission, I've been to China. What a mess. I mean, there's people walking around with these masks on their noses in Beijing, because of... So a lot of these issues that I've been involved with, and I'll write about them, essentially my magnum opus, will be about big government, big business, and big science. And actually a TV program, which is the basis of the book. Just you go to the envirovideo.com website, you can see it listed about there's 700 programs on that website that I've done, and have been nationally aired. My program is aired on nearly 200 cable systems in 40 states, and on the various satellite systems and so forth. The Enviro Close-Up with Karl Grossman. But I did a program about 2 years ago titled Choose Life. Choose Life. And I get into the points that I've learned in this, what would be my magnum opus, and also the same as in the TV show, what I've learned in now almost 60 years of being a journalist, more than 60 years of being a journalist. I started in 62. That this is life and death stuff. The relationship between cancer and pollution. I mean, I cite in the book and I cite on the TV show various U.S. government reports, particularly done during the Carter administration. When Reagan got in, and I've written about this, Jim Sebison, who was a PR guy at the EPA, said they were issued orders, the EPA PR people, never to use cancer-causing in front of the word chemicals. Unbelievable. And then I get into people of color being the leading victims, actually.
Sure.
I was very early in environmental racism, what's called environmental justice now. I get into religion in the environment and how also all the great religions, not to mention Native people, prize nature. And so there's no conflict between good science and religion and so forth. I get into, what are the other things I get into? Well, I get into how this is not needed. PCBs, for example. And another book I wrote called The Poison Conspiracy. Monsanto is pushing polychlorinated biphenyls, which it developed and marketed for decades, claiming they were wonderful and we couldn't have an industrial society without them. Finally, when PCBs were outlawed, first in Japan, they got into rice oil. PCBs, old ballasts of fluorescent lights had PCBs in them, or go along a railroad track and you'll see transformers. It's an insulating fluid. It was ubiquitous. Monsanto made a lot of money on polychlorinated biphenyls, but finally when there was the huge incident in Japan, and some PCB fluid got into rice oil, and people died. A lot of people got sick. then finally, the U.S. banned PCBs. Now there's still ballast in fluorescent bulbs, and there's still transformers along long railroad tracks, and other uses of what had been purposes used for PCBs. What's being used instead of PCBs? Mineral oil. Nothing space age, just mineral oil. So, and then what else do I get into? I'm thinking in this book. There's no need for the poisons. We can, and so forth. So, again, that would be my 8th book. That if people want to see a 29-minute condensation of the material that will be in a 300-page book, just go to envirovideo.com and check out Choose Life. When you go down the long list of programs, including the many I've done in the last couple of years about how nuclear power is not a green energy source, and how nuclear power is not emissions free. Yeah, there's the website right there. You can just look down. 3 Mile Island Revisited. Well, those are some of the documentaries. Jump on the opening page if you would, James. Here we go. Media designed to empower people. Again, giving them the information. And just jump down if you would. We're broadcast nationally on Free Speech TV, and there's these short pieces during the Democracy Now! Show. And here's one on hemp. Please keep going. Another one on hemp, part 2, part 1 on hemp. Nuclear is not the solution. The folly of atomic power in the age of climate change. Here's one on artificial turf, the new nuclear push, and so forth. And then meanwhile, James, my wife is telling me we have to go. We have to leave now.
No, look, this is perfect. And you kind of left it off perfectly, too. When the new book comes out, we'll have to have you come back on here. I will have all these links in the description, envirovideo.com, Envirovideo's YouTube page, and then, of course, your website, which has the link to Cover Up. I'm still making my way through Cover Up, so that'll probably be something we can talk in a little more granular detail the next time we have you on. But I just want to thank you so much for giving me all your time today and working with me through all the tech issues. Is there anything you want to leave the people with before we completely stop this recording?
No, they should learn about all this stuff. Education is important, and then action is important. They can't let us, destroy life. We have to choose life, and we have to challenge the forces of darkness. They've always existed, but not on this scale, and not with these consequences, particularly when you talk about nuclear technology.
Well, I couldn't agree more with that. I just, again, thank you so much for coming on here. And this has been the Totally Legitimate Business Show, folks. Please enjoy the links provided in the description, and we'll catch you on the next one.
This has been the Totally Legitimate Business Podcast. The end. With your host, James Oliva. Executive producers, Clint G and James Oliva. That's obnoxious. Sound design, mix, and master by James Oliva. Literally no one cares. For more Totally Legitimate Business, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Totally Legitimate Business, or add us on TikTok at TLB Pod. When will this end? Thank you for listening. Now get back to work. Move it along, buddy.